End quote. You're trespassing, son. Step back onto the community sidewalk before I have you arrested for violating the peace of Oak Ridge Estates. End quote. That's exactly how she greeted me, standing there in her $800 yoga pants like she owned the very air I was breathing, while I was literally standing on a patch of dirt my family has paid taxes on since Harry Truman was in the White House. I just stepped out of my truck after a 20-hour drive from the base, still wearing my scorched OCPs and tasting the desert dust in the back of my throat, only to find a shiny white Range Rover parked sideways across my private gate. This woman, who I later learned was named Victoria Sterling, didn't know me from Adam, but she'd already decided I was a threat to her manicured suburban dream, and she was currently staring at my 1948 flatbed Ford like it was a pile of burning tires in the middle of a cathedral. She had her thumb hovering over the call button on her iPhone, looking me up and down with that special kind of disgust only a bored HOA president can muster, and she had no idea that she'd just picked a fight with a guy who spent the last decade building bridges and fortification for the Army Corps of Engineers. And let me tell you, when you spend your life studying how things are built, you learn exactly how to tear them down. Legally speaking, of course. See, to understand how this whole mess blew up, you've got to understand the Blackwood Ranch. My granddad, Silas Blackwood, bought this 200-acre slice of the Oregon Hills back in 1946 when there wasn't an Oppos, a single paved road for 10 miles, and he spent 50 years turning it into a working cattle ranch that actually gave back to the land. I grew up here, learning how to fix a fence before I could ride a bike, and understanding that the creek running through our property was the lifeblood of everything we did. But while I was overseas doing 2 tours in the Middle East, the world outside our fences changed, and not for the better. A developer named Marcus Vance bought up the old timber lot next door and slapped together a luxury subdivision called Oak Ridge Estates, which was basically a bunch of overpriced gray boxes with 5-foot yards and rules so strict you probably needed a permit to sneeze on your own patio. Victoria was the queen of that hive, and from what the neighbors told me later, she'd spent the last 2 years treating the surrounding countryside like it was her personal kingdom, trying to, civilize, the locals by filing noise complaints against tractors and calling the county about the, unrefined, smell of manure during harvest season. The trouble really started about 3 days after I got home. Once the jet lag wore off, and I started noticing the little yellow slips of paper taped to my mailbox every morning. They weren't into Oppos, just letters. They were formal HOA violation notices, which was hilarious because I wasn't into Oppos, even in their neighborhood. Victoria was claiming that my, industrial agricultural activities, were a nuisance to the, health and aesthetic harmony, of her residents, and she was demanding that I relocate my 3 prize Hereford bulls because their lowing was, and I'm quoting here, causing psychological distress to the community's pampered pets, I try to be the bigger person, I really did. So I walked over to her house one afternoon to explain that the Blackwood Ranch was grandfathered in, under original county zoning, and that my bulls had been here long before her Range Rover was even a sketch on a designer in Oppos' desk. She didn't into Oppos to even open the screen door. She just looked through the mesh with this tight, plastic smile and told me that, times change, Mr. Blackwood, and progress doesn't into Oppos. Stop for nostalgia, before informing me that her husband's law firm had already drafted a petition to have my land rezoned as strictly residential. That was the moment the, nice veteran, part of my brain clicked off and the, combat engineer, part took over. If she wanted to play a game of inches, I was going to make sure she knew exactly how many inches she was actually standing on. I spent the next week at the county clerk's office, buried in dusty topographic maps and property deeds that looked like they were written on parchment, because something Victoria said about, community property, during our first encounter didn't in Oppos. Sit right with me. I'm a licensed surveyor. It's what the Army trained me to do, and as I started overlaying the original 1946 deeds with the new subdivision plats Marcus Vance had filed in 2021, I saw it. It was a tiny discrepancy, a 4-degree error in a corner monument that had been carried forward through 3 decades of sloppy paperwork. But in the world of property law, A 4-degree error at the start of a boundary line becomes a massive problem a mile down the road. I called up an old friend from the Corps, a guy named Miller who specializes in environmental litigation, and we spent a Saturday out in the brush with a high-end GPS total station, locating the original iron pins my granddad had hammered into the basalt back in the day. As Miller watched the data climb on the screen, he just started whistling low and shaking his head, looking up at the fancy Oak Ridge Estates entrance with its stone pillars, waterfall feature, and the $200,000 security gate. End quote. Garrett, end quote. He said, pointing to the laser level, end quote. You see that waterfall they're so proud of? And about 40 feet of their main access road? Yeah, that's not theirs. According to the original Stone to Blackwood deed of and oppos, 46, your property line doesn't end oppos, T-stop at the fence. It extends right through the middle of their community clubhouse, end quote. I just stood there for a second, smelling the pine needles and the distant scent of rain, feeling this strange mix of disbelief and absolute, cold-blooded satisfaction. Because Victoria hadn't an oppos. T just been barking at the wrong dog. She'd been building her doghouse on my porch. But I didn't an oppos. T rush out and tell her right away. No, you don't an oppos. T reveal your position until the fortifications are complete. Instead, I watched as she doubled down on her harassment, sending a crew of private, end quote, inspectors, end quote, to my fence line to take photos of my workshop, claiming I was running an unlicensed commercial repair shop because I was helping my neighbor, Old Man Riley, rebuild his 1960s tractor. She even went so far as to call the state water board, claiming that my cattle were, end quote, poisoning, end quote, the creek, hoping they'd shut me down on environmental grounds. That was her biggest mistake. The inspectors came out, took their samples, and found that the water entering my property was pristine, but the water leaving the subdivision was loaded with high nitrogen fertilizers and chemical pesticide from all those, end quote. Perfect, end quote. Greenlawns Victoria insisted on. Not only was I not the polluter, but her precious HOA was actually violating the Clean Water Act. The escalation hit a boiling point when I received a, end quote, notice of intent to lien, end quote, on my property for unpaid fines that I didn't end oppos, to even owe to an association I wasn't oppos, T part of. Victoria actually had the nerve to walk onto my driveway while I was under the truck, tapping her heels on the concrete to get my attention, and told me that if I didn't end oppos, T sell the, end quote, back 50, end quote, to her husband oppos, S Development Group for pennies on the dollar, they'd tie me up in court until I was bankrupt. She looked down at me, her shadow blocking the sun, and said, end quote, you're a relic, Garrett. This land is meant for families who appreciate the finer things, not for people who live in grease and dirt. Just sign the papers and go find a trailer park somewhere that suits your temperament. End quote. I didn't an oppos, T say a word. I just slid out from under the truck, wiped my hands on a rag, and handed her a manila envelope. It wasn't an oppos, T a sales agreement. It was a, end quote, notice of quiet title action, end quote, and a, end quote, formal demand for vacation of encroachment, end quote. The look on her face when her lawyer finally explained what those papers meant was something I'll cherish until the day I die. It turns out that because of that 1946 deed error, the, end quote, community property, end quote, the HOA had been bragging about was actually a legal fiction. The land under their clubhouse, their gate, and the first 3 houses in the cul-de-sac belonged to the Blackwood Ranch. And because the developer had used a, end quote, quit claim, end quote, deed instead of a, end quote, warranty, end quote, deed when transferring the common areas to the HOA, the association was now legally liable for building on land they didn't end oppos, own. But the real kicker was the, end quote, nuclear option, end quote, I'd tucked into the back of the filing. My granddad hadn't end oppos. T just bought the land. He bought the mineral and quarry rights. Under Oregon law, if you own the quarry rights and the land is zoned for agricultural or resource use, which mine was, you have a protected right to conduct those operations. So about 48 hours before the big, end quote, Community Harmony Gala, end quote, Victoria was hosting to celebrate their 3rd anniversary, I pulled a few favors with some old buddies in the construction business. On a Tuesday morning, exactly at 7 a.m., 3 heavy-duty excavators, and a rock crusher rolled up to the very edge of my property line, which just happened to be about 10 feet away from the Oak Ridge swimming pool. We started the engines, and the sound was like a low-frequency earthquake that shook the wine glasses right off the tables in their clubhouse. When Victoria came charging out, screaming about noise ordinances and calling the police, I was standing there with a clipboard and a permit from the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. I leaned over the fence and said, and quote, "Morning, Victoria. Since you're so worried about property values, I decided to diversify. We're doing some and oppos, exploratory and oppos, excavation for a new gravel pit. It's perfectly legal under my 1946 mineral rights. And since this is an agricultural zone, I can run these machines 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Hope you like the sound of progress." End quote. The police arrived, then the county sheriff, then the HOA's terrified lawyers. For 3 hours, we stood in the middle of the road while they pored over the maps I provided. The sheriff, a guy who'd known my granddad and had zero patience for Victoria's histrionics, eventually closed his notebook and looked at her. End quote. "Mon oppos, end quote. He said, end quote, "This man is on his property, and according to these certified surveys, so is about half of your front office. Technically, he's got more right to be standing here than you do. If you want him to stop the noise, I suggest you start talking about a settlement, because right now, he's the landlord and you're the squatter." End quote. The fallout was a total collapse for Oak Ridge Estates. Once the residents found out their titles were clouded and their HOA dues had been spent on legal battles to harass a veteran instead of actually securing the land their homes were built on, they turned on Victoria like a pack of wolves. It came out in discovery that she and her husband had known about the boundary discrepancy months ago, but tried to bully me into selling the land so they couldn't, quote, fix, end quote, the mistake before anyone noticed. That's called fraud. The HOA was forced into a massive settlement that basically drained their reserves. And because they couldn't and oppos to pay the mounting fines for the water pollution and the illegal encroachment, the association was legally dissolved by a court-appointed receiver. Today, the Oak Ridge Estate sign is gone. The big stone pillars are still there, but now they have a small, hand-painted wooden sign that says, end quote, "Blackwood Ranch, established 1946, end quote. The residents are still there, but they don't and oppos to have an HOA anymore. They just have, end quote, neighborly cooperation agreement, end quote, that I helped draft, which basically says, end quote, don't and oppos, to be a jerk and mind your own business." End quote. Victoria and her husband moved out under the cover of night after their house went into foreclosure in the last. I heard she was trying to sue her realtor in another state. As for me, I'm back in my workshop. The bulls are happy, the creek is clean, and the only noise I hear in the morning is the wind through the pines and the sound of a tractor that actually belongs on this land. But makes you wonder, doesn't it, oppos, it? How many of these, end quote, communities, end quote, are built on nothing but ego and bad paperwork? And why is it that some people feel the need to destroy what was there before just to feel like they're in control of something? I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Did I go too far with the rock crusher? Or was that exactly the kind of, end quote, wake-up call, end quote, a person like Victoria needed? Have you ever had a neighbor try to tell you what to do on your own dirt? And how did you handle it? Drop a comment below and let me know your stories, because in a world full of Victorias, we need to make sure the Blackwoods of the world keep their gates locked and their deeds ready. Don and oppos, forget to hit that like button if you think justice was served, and subscribe for more stories where the little guy or the guy with the big excavator actually wins. I'll see you in the next one.